Welcome back to Popcorn Recap. This is part 2 of our Queen Charlotte series. But you don't need to watch the first part to understand this, since the 4th episode shows King George's perspective. Basically, Charlotte became the first Black Queen of England. She married King George, and she just found out why he's been pushing her away. George is very sick with a disease that affects his mental stability. Back to the episode, Queen Charlotte and the butler Reynolds clean up King George after having discovered him talking nonsense in the gardens. Charlotte is angry at Reynolds as she questions him about her husband's ailments, but Reynolds doesn't respond. In a flashback, George's mother, Princess Augusta, and Lord Bute tell the king that they've found him a queen, a German named Charlotte. Augusta reminds him of his duty as king, to produce an heir to the throne. Suddenly, George starts to talk in nonsense as he mentions the moon and sky. Before the crowd sees his madness, Augusta tells the men to leave the room. Augusta hugs her son as his mind and body crumbles. Later, a group of doctors try to advise Augusta on what to do to heal George. Dr. Monroe, a mental specialist, grabs Augusta's attention. The other doctors remind Monroe that if King George was diagnosed with mental incapacity, he'd forfeit the throne. Monroe says that they can just heal the king using affirmations to remind George that he is king, and it works for now. During his wedding day, King George shows his trembling hands to Monroe, as George starts to doubt his own mental stability. Monroe slaps the shit out of him to remind him he's king. This somehow snaps him back to normal. I wish this worked for my depression. After getting married, King George leaves Charlotte to live in her own estate. While he hides in his observatory, he tells Reynolds that Queen Charlotte is too good and beautiful for him and his deformity. One day, King George tells Monroe that he wants to be cured, and he's willing to go the extremes for a cure. Monroe says there might be a way, but it would require George to follow Monroe's orders. A montage ensues of Monroe putting George through a tight morning schedule, a nice bath, and oatmeal for breakfast. Monroe believes the origin of George's fits lie in his undisciplined lifestyle. Monroe straps him into a chair and begins a weird dominatrix style of training. They use leeches on him, drown him in ice water, and he eats more oatmeal. George tells Reynolds that he is willing to go the distance with this treatment because he so badly wants to be with Charlotte. Then, George decides to give Charlotte a Pomeranian dog that he stole from Monroe. Instead of his ice baths, he decides to farm outside. This inspires him to dine with his wife. However, while waiting for Queen Charlotte, George starts to have his physical and mental fits again. Reynolds taps him on the shoulder and George manages to snap back to normal. He should have slapped him silly. This is the night George decided to go home to Buckingham Palace. Dr. Monroe is upset with George about this. We are shown a montage of the king and queen's budding romance, and George starts to believe he's cured, so he dismisses Dr. Monroe. One night, King George finds the doctor still in the palace. It turns out he is now treating Queen Charlotte, who Monroe thinks is pregnant. George goes upstairs to go to bed, but then he becomes mentally unstable and starts scribbling on the walls. This is where George runs to the garden and strips naked. The next day, George wakes up to an empty bed and finds his scribbles on the wall. He sees Queen Charlotte riding the carriage away to visit Augusta. Charlotte yells at Augusta for not telling her the king is mad. Augusta yells back and says he's not mad, he's just tired from being king. Augusta says she has done her best to hide her son's ailments to keep stability and order. Charlotte feels deceived though and yells back, clearly showing she's unhappy with her marriage to King George. Unbeknownst to her, George was listening in on the conversation. Afterwards, George asks Monroe to strap him up again. Kinky. In the present day, Queen Charlotte is trying to find suitable brides for her sons so there can be a legitimate heir to the throne. During an opera, Lady Violet and Lady Danbury comment on how the queen must be lonely. Even though the king isn't dead, Lady Danbury says Queen Charlotte is kinder a widow like them. In the past, after Lady Danbury's husband has died, Lady Danbury looks suspiciously interested at Lord Ledger. In the middle of the night, she vents to her maid Coral about how surprisingly sad she is about her husband's death. She feels like she doesn't have an identity outside of her husband. Meanwhile, Queen Charlotte is confirmed to be pregnant. Princess Augusta says she will move to Buckingham Palace in order to ensure the child's safe birth, to which Charlotte is upset about this. Charlotte writes a letter that Brimsley delivers to Reynolds to give to the king. These two have a budding romance, but they keep it on the down low. When he delivers the letter to King George, he is being tortured, and Dr. Monroe says the king isn't allowed letters. So, Reynolds puts the letters in a pile with all of Queen Charlotte's past letters. The next day, Lord Danbury's family wonders how succession is passed down now that Lady Danbury's husband is dead. They are quite concerned since this is the first time black people were given titles as lords and ladies. Lady Danbury doesn't have any answers, but looks through papers to find them. Meanwhile, Queen Charlotte wonders why the king hasn't responded to her letters. Later, the queen is having a wedding portrait done of her, but the king hasn't been painted in yet. Charlotte tells the painter to paint her skin darker as it actually is. Princess Augusta interrupts and tells the painter number. and to paint the skin lighter, almost pale. This pisses Charlotte off. One night, Brimsley takes it upon himself to read Queen Charlotte's letter before dropping it off. It's a letter to her brother asking for a male chaperone to leave the country. Reynolds tells Brimsley he has the duty to drop off the letter, even though Brimsley doesn't want to. During her walk, Lady Danbury bumps into Lord Ledger. She expresses how she could no longer lay in bed to mourn. Lord Ledger offers to meet her again tomorrow, so they can walk and talk to keep her mind off her husband's death. In the present day, Queen Charlotte introduces her sons to princesses in hopes they produce a legitimate heir to the throne. To their surprise, they are betrothed to marry them next week. Meanwhile, Violet tells Lady Danbury that she is in heat, and it's been difficult for her to cope without her husband. Violet admits that she almost asked a footman to lie on top of her. Back to the past, Lady Danbury meets with Lord Ledger, Lady Violet's father. They go on their walk together and Lord Ledger talks about the beauty of nature. As time passes, the two take their daily walks together. Back to the present, the two betrothed brothers, Edward and William, present Queen Charlotte with their other brother, George. According to law, George has to approve all the marriages in the family. Their plan backfires as Queen Charlotte's mere stature intimidates George into approving the marriages. Finally, Queen Charlotte's brother Adolphus arrives. She tells him she wants to go home. However, Adolphus reminds her that Charlotte's body is no longer hers since she's with the king's child. If she were to run away, it would be considered kidnapping. During one of their walks, Lady Danbury and Lord Ledger almost kiss, but Lord Ledger stops himself. Lady Danbury reminisces about this in the present. Later, a solicitor tells Lady Danbury that since Lord Danbury has died, the title and everything reverts back to the crown. Therefore, she would be Lady of Nothing and live back in her old house. However, the solicitor tells her that Lord Danbury had actually used a lot of their money to fund their new lifestyle. So she literally is Lady of Nothing, Lady of Penniless, Dowager Brocass. Later, Augusta tells Charlotte that she doesn't even have to see the king again if she doesn't want. Since she's already produced an heir, she can see him again if they need another heir. Queen Charlotte mourns over this, and Brimsley comforts her from afar. Brimsley goes to Reynolds to inquire if King George can meet with Charlotte. Reynolds refuses this because he simply cannot. King George is too busy with Dr. Monroe trying to heal his ailments. The strain between the royal couple is actually causing a strain between Brimsley's and Reynolds' love affair. Sometime later, Lady Danbury brings her son Dominic over to Augusta to see if she would give him a title. Before Augusta calls him Lord Danbury, Lord Bute stops her, so Augusta just calls him a handsome boy. Afterwards, Lady Danbury tells Dominic that he is still Lord Danbury and to never forget it. Meanwhile, Lord Ledger is making Lady Danbury a special hat. Lady Violet agrees to help him. One day, Queen Charlotte visits Lady Danbury and says she will never go back to Buckingham Palace. It turns out she wants to stay with Lady Danbury. Lady Danbury tells her maid that she is afraid to commit treason with Queen Charlotte in her house, since she's with the king's baby. With Lady Danbury's discretion and talk with Queen Charlotte, Charlotte agrees to go home back to Buckingham Palace. In the present, Queen Charlotte's sons are finally being married off to princesses. Back in the past, Lord Ledger visits Lady Danbury at her estate. He gifts her a birthday hat. The two share a passionate kiss. The two end up doing it. In comparison to her late husband, Lady Danbury gets on top of Lord Ledger, as if to demand equality, and Lord Ledger allows it. In the present, Lady Danbury finds the hat Lord Ledger had gifted her. Then, Queen Charlotte forces her way to see the king even though Dr. Monroe prohibits it. Charlotte finds King George being tortured, and she asks everyone to leave. George is out of it though, and Charlotte begs him to come back to her. She places his hand on her belly, and he's able to remember who he is. The Queen orders Monroe to be removed from the grounds as she found his methods unethical. She also tells the butlers she will be moving to Kew with her husband. Dr. Monroe goes to Princess Augusta, and she's shocked to find out the Queen had dismissed him of his duty. In the present, Lady Violet tells Lady Danbury that she will be starting anew to find a manual. Later, Lady Violet ends up finding the hat she helped her father make. She instantly knows that her father may have had an affair with Lady Danbury. Meanwhile, Queen Charlotte yells at her kids for not having a legitimate heir. The Queen's sons and new brides have been unsuccessful so far. In the observatory, George demands Queen Charlotte to go back to her house. However, Charlotte refuses to ever leave his side. She realizes that George has been pushing her away because he loves her so much, and he's afraid that Charlotte may not love her back with his mental illness. He admits he's loved her since Charlotte tried to climb up the wall. Charlotte says they can tackle this together. The next morning, George rubs Charlotte's belly and says hello to the little king. Meanwhile, Lady Danbury meets Lord Ledger but is surprised to see Lady Violet. Lady Danbury takes this as a rejection and wishes him farewell. In the present, Georgie and his wife complain to Queen Charlotte about how difficult she's been with trying to push them to have babies. She says she has lost many babies and is trying her best. Charlotte is surprised to hear this. Georgie finally tells his mom off, saying she's never been a real mother to her children. She's always just been acting as a queen. In the past, Brimsley and Reynolds hope that the king and queen will be together for a lifetime, so that they too can serve them together for a lifetime. The next day, Lady Danbury tries to get Augusta to claim Dominic as Lord Danbury, and to pass on her late husband's titles to Danbury's child. But Augusta doesn't fall for it. Augusta tries to get information out of Lady Danbury, but she refuses to give her any this time. When Augusta visits Queen Charlotte, Charlotte refuses Augusta to see the king. Augusta is upset and tells Charlotte that the king cannot hide forever. He has a kingdom to rule, and Charlotte is simply allowing this behavior. Charlotte then relays this message to George, that he must address Parliament and move back to Buckingham. The show transitions to Queen Charlotte, pissed off that her children would talk back to her. Brimsley openly tells Charlotte that she's always been a great queen, but not necessarily the best mother. Charlotte realizes Brimsley had never married because no one would be willing to be with him when all he does is serve the queen. In the present, Lady Violet pries if Lady Danbury ever had anyone after Lord Danbury. Danbury says that she had something going on with the Queen's brother, Adolphus. Lady Violet is shocked to hear this as she expected Lady Danbury to mention her father. In the past, Adolphus decides to court Lady Danbury and she obliges. Meanwhile, King George is stressing over his speech to Parliament. Suddenly, Queen Charlotte feels the baby coming. Unfortunately, the baby is breached, coming out feet first. With the help of George, baby Georgie comes out healthy. Augusta wonders if there are any signs of defects. George says he's perfection. The next day, Lady Danbury is with Adolphus, but soon sees Lord Ledger and feels the love wooziness. Then, Augusta tries to get Lady Danbury to spill some beans, but she refuses. Augusta threatens to take away her fine estate and all the equality she was given. Lady Danbury begins to sob, and Augusta tells her it is difficult to navigate a man's world. However, Augusta was able to do it by securing her son as king. She demands Lady Danbury to work for it, and so, Lady Danbury does. She is finally willing to divulge secrets of the Queen as long as Augusta gives her son the title of Lord Danbury. Before his speech, King George shakes uncontrollably. Charlotte kisses him to help calm his nerves. Unfortunately, King George crawls onto the floor of the carriage and never delivers his speech. Then, Charlotte finds him hiding under the bed feeling like a failure. He feels guilty for not being able to give himself fully since he's not always there mentally. Charlotte says she's okay with this because she loves him. The next day, Adolphus visits Lady Danbury to propose to her. He allows her to think about it as he kisses her goodbye. Later, Augusta talks to Lord Bute, who is angry that the king didn't address Parliament. And now they're throwing a ball to introduce the prince to the world. Lord Bute warns Augusta that if the king doesn't perform well during the ball, then he must take matters in his own hands. At the ball, everyone important gathers. The racist Vivian Ledger criticizes Violet on how to act accordingly. Violet waves to Lady Danbury as Lord Ledger and her stare at each other longingly. Eventually, the king and queen make their appearance. George gets nervous at first, but Charlotte calms him down. She tells him to just look at her and pretend no one else is there. It works as they dance in front of everyone. He makes a toast to his new son, the future king. Later, Adolphus tells Lady Danbury what her life would be like if they were to marry. It all sounds nice, but Lady Danbury says she cannot marry him. She says she doesn't want to marry anyone ever again and needs to navigate the world on her own. During the ball, Augusta finally thanks Charlotte for being a great wife to George. Subsequently, Reynolds and Brimsley have a dance together. The show transitions to Brimsley dancing on his own. In the present, Queen Charlotte gets good news about Victoria being pregnant. She thanks her son Edward for doing good work. Back to the ball, Lady Danbury gets scolded by Queen Charlotte for refusing her brother's proposal. But Queen Charlotte is more offended that Lady Danbury never came to her about concerns for her title and estate. Charlotte lets Lady Danbury know that she is to keep her title as Lady and she will always be there to protect her. In the present, Lady Violet invites Lady Danbury over to show her all the hats her father Lord Ledger used to make. Lady Danbury realizes that Violet knows about her affair, and the two are both happy with the cheerful memory of Lord Ledger. Subsequently, Queen Charlotte visits King George, who is sketching out random things on the walls. Charlotte hides under the bed, and George decides to join her. He's brought back to reality and he's given the news about Edward's new child. He's happy to hear that their family line will live on. They share a kiss and George is happy Charlotte did not go over the wall. That was the end of the series. I thought this was very romantic. What did you guys think?
Subscribe for more videos like this. Turn on notifications and leave a like. It really helps the channel.